Life is a dream, time like a stream, carries our burdens away. Never despair, joys everywhere, love can befriend you today. Free from all care, like birds of the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay.
Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions defy. Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us to a light to draw nigh. Life is a dream, time like a stream, carries our burdens away. Never despair, joys everywhere, love can befriend you today. Free from all care, like birds on the air, soar above griefs and worries, seek joy and be gay. Often on earth, things of great worth, worldly ambitions defy. Sometimes a friend helps us ascend up from life's cares to the sky. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us to a light to draw nigh. Love is a star, though shining afar. It can guide us and help us to a light to draw nigh.
This reading is from Rays of the Same Light by Swami Kriyananda and is titled, Life is a Dream. This passage is from the 14th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the 24th and 25th stanzas. In these stanzas, Krishna describes the enlightened sage. Unaffected by outward joys and sorrows, or by praise and blame, secure in his divine nature, regarding with equal gaze a clod of mud, a stone, a bar of gold, impartial toward all experiences, whether pleasant or unpleasant, firm-minded, untouched by either praise or blame, treating everyone alike, whether friend or foe, free from the delusion that in anything he does, he is the doer. Such a one has transcended nature's triune qualities. In this passage, we find expressed the positive side of austerity. Austerity, as presented here, doesn't mean fanaticism or exaggerated self-discipline. Rather, it signifies the calm realization that this universe is only a dream, and that nothing matters except God's love and the eternal joy of loving Him. Strenuous effort is required, certainly, especially in the early stages of the spiritual life, to reject all delusive attachments and desires. The devotee can avoid discouragement by reflecting on the bright side of renunciation, the soul's eventual freedom in God. In that divine state, he should remind himself, the soul will be untouched by delusion of any kind. Devastating storms of emotion may rage around him. He will remain ever at the storm's center, blissful, self-possessed. Renunciation without the thought of its higher purpose may set a person in conflict with himself. Or, again, one who embraces renunciation for its own sake may sink into that smug self-righteousness, which is more or less the only reward people get who follow the spiritual path joylessly. When a businessman reinvests some of his profits instead of spending them, it is in the hope of increasing his prosperity. And when a person refrains from replying cuttingly to a verbal assault from a friend, it is to preserve their friendship. Mature human beings realize that worthwhile goals can be achieved only if they invest energy toward them instead of squandering it. The same is true on the spiritual path. Renunciation represents an investment, the lesser interest, in exchange for the greatest of all possible gains. People often remonstrate, "When you go off and meditate, you are only avoiding life." This charge can be answered with a simple question. Do they themselves reproach high school graduates for going on to college instead of immediately seeking jobs? Certainly not. They know that a higher education will help them to find better jobs later on. The same is true for the spiritual search. The devotee who meditates daily gains increasing mental clarity. In this sense, indeed, he finds immediate benefits from meditation, as well as long-term ones. His increasing inner clarity enables him to cope efficiently with the most mundane problems. Thus, through the Bhagavad Gita, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
And from Whispers from Eternity. Bless me that I may know that I am dreaming, even though my senses tell me that I am awake. And Master writes, as we rest and sleep, wake in the morning to our daily round of desperate seeming, but only half-conscious activity, then fall back to sleep again at night. So also do we pass fleetingly from birth to life to death again, waking ever and again in new bodies, dashing about our appointments and other commitments, delighting in them or groaning at their importunity, then finding ourselves forced to leave everything at death's next summons. Dream after dream of ceaseless earthly struggles. On the sleigh of incarnations, we find ourselves sliding by hopes and disappointments, victories and failures, fulfillments and disillusionments. When the smooth snow of easy passage melts and the underlying ice of insecurity breaks, we find ourselves plunged into heaving seas, eddies of gay and desperate laughter, sargassos of cloying involvements, vast calms of indifference. Ah, all only dreams. When at last I awoke in thee, I discovered that I'd been dreaming all along. I'd only thought I was awake. So Master here is saying, at last when I wake in thee, and that's what it takes. It's not enough just to believe that it's a dream and be told that it's a dream and point to the book and say it's a dream. We have to realize it. And that realization comes when we awaken God. Just last week, I was dreaming, and it was a very vivid and very real dream. And at that moment when you come out of sleep, you're still dreaming and you start to wake up, and you're a little bit awake, but you're also still having that dream. I was at that moment where I was aware that I was dreaming. And it had seemed so real. And as I was watching my dream, I just kept saying over and over again in my mind, it's just a dream, it's just a dream. I was in awe that it was just a dream because it seemed so real moments before. And then as I came into wakefulness and started looking around my bedroom, somehow I just kept saying, it's just a dream, it's just a dream. And I started looking around my room, and I just realized, yes, it's just a dream, all of this. And so when we wake in God, not just waking up from death and we go to the astral plane, because if that's all it is, we have to keep coming back again and again and again, living it all over again, all these dualities that make this dream seem so real. And Yoganandaji used the analogy of this dream. He sometimes would call it a dream. Sometimes he would talk about it as a movie. And he talked about this beam of light that he saw coming from the back of the theater. And this movie seemed so real. And the way he put it is really striking, because he said, this life is no more real than a movie. And he didn't say it's analogous to a movie, it's kind of sort of like a movie. He said it's no more real than a movie. That's a very powerful statement. This is not real at all. It truly is a dream. But how do we realize that? And that's the catch. Because it's not just enough to hear Devarshi pound the pulpit and the book and wave it and say it's a dream, it's a dream. We have to realize it. We have to wake up. And so this is really, much of the spiritual path is this learning how to wake up, but also going through life with this memory of it being a dream. And it's a very good practice just to keep reminding ourselves that it is a dream. And it doesn't mean that we can be indifferent to what's going on and indifferent to other people's sufferings, for example. And with some of these teachings, it's very inappropriate to apply them to other people and someone who's suffering and miserable and in pain and just go up to them smiling and say, oh, it's just a dream, it's just a dream, which is, well, it's cruel, actually it is, and it's sort of insulting. One of our teachers at Ananda Village, one of my favorite acharyas, Nayaswami Anandi, she pointed out something that I had seen in myself, so I was able to laugh at myself. But she said that when you hear a truth, like at a Sunday satsang and you're in a room with your friends and maybe with some people who you have a really hard time with and you're always butting heads with and this person irritates you, she said, be sure that when you hear the truth, you don't mentally shake your fist at that person and say, see, you should listen to this. You need to pay attention to that. Because she said we need to apply these things to ourselves. And not in a hard or harsh way, but in a compassionate way. This is especially one of those, that this life being a dream, but also this very parallel thing that Swamiji strangely ties together. It makes sense when he says it, but tying it together with the practice of austerity. Because you'll find that if you can get through life and see that it is duality and get behind the screen of duality, and this is where Master says, this is how we get there, is that the trap is the duality of this world. And the duality is pleasure, pain, love, hate, success, failure, life, death, all these things. And it's a roller coaster ride, and we're caught in that roller coaster ride. And the way Master said to get beyond it is to look behind the screen. And what is behind that screen is divine bliss. Divine bliss is one, it's what we were made of. But that screen is hiding who and what we really are. And this is why meditation is so important. This is why prayer, self-offering, all these things are important. And also just, again, going through life, going through all the duality, the ups and downs, and just understanding that it is a dream. And when you can do that, it doesn't mean that you're coldly indifferent. If you do it in the right way, if it's just sort of a mental image, then yeah, it can make your heart cold and indifferent to other people and lack of compassion. But if you do it in the real sense of seeing the one behind the dream, then you are filled with compassion and with the love of God and Divine Mother and a desire to help others get out of this dream rather than just wagging our finger at them and saying it's just a dream, wake up. I think you'll find if we do that too much, one day Divine Mother will finally have enough of us and start slapping us in the face until we start screaming with pain and finally say, you said it was a dream, why are you screaming at this? Because we do have to realize it. We can't just state it, affirm it, although that helps to remember it because sometimes we just forget. And really, that's really what it's all about. We just forgot. We come from the astral where we're closer to God and closer to truth. We're closer to bliss. We come born into this world And we wake up and it's like, where am I? What happened? And then very soon it starts to catch up to us. Nayaswami Deviji tells a story of two children. I don't know if they were Ananda children or someone that she knew, but one was about 2 years old and the other one was 4 or 5 years old. And the mother heard the two of them talking quietly and seemingly meaningfully. And the mother went to hear what they were talking about. And the older one, the 5-year-old, was saying to the 2-year-old, I'm already forgetting what it was like. It was so beautiful and it was so free, and I'm forgetting. Please tell me what it was like up there. Tell me what it was like. Because what happens is after a few years of life, we start to forget. And all the beatings of life, Yoganandaji called them, they start to make us think that this is very, very real. And so again, the way out is not indifference, but going to the one and getting behind and communing with the dreamer of this dream. I'm going to tell a story of how we can do this, because our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, in a way, really what's hiding this sort of true realization that it's a dream is not out there. It's all in here. And if we can change ourselves, Brahmachari Jamal, a line that he uses a lot, he says it's an inside job where we really are having to work on inside of ourselves and changing ourselves. And when we can change ourselves, it's not, because sometimes I think people get very skillful even at changing the dream and manipulating it and being successful and becoming very happy by doing everything right. But somewhere along the way, life tricks them and they stumble and they trip, and it just doesn't work that way because it is based on duality and ups and downs. So we do have to change ourselves. But I think people don't realize how close we are to realizing this and becoming one again. By the time we come to this point, where we're sitting in a room, yearning for God, wanting true teaching, a true teacher, starting to meditate, we're very, very close. Paramhansa Yogananda said that God is just behind your thoughts, just behind your thoughts. And that may seem, in a way, like God is really far away because of all these millions and gazillions of thoughts that we have. But I just want to tell a story that many years ago, for many years at Ananda Village, about a half mile from Ananda Village itself, there was this very old barn that was just decrepit. It was a huge barn, but it took about 30 years to completely fall apart. And it was amazing that it still stood that long. Boards were missing, trees were growing from inside through the roof. They finally had to put police tape around it to prevent anybody from walking inside of it. And some people at Ananda Village wanted to talk to the owners and get rid of that barn because it was sort of an eyesore, kind of a low energy. But I loved that barn. I just had the fondest feelings possible about that barn. And there was a reason, which is that when I lived at Ananda Village, I would very often travel all over the United States, sometimes to South America, to do workshops, classes. And so I would be on the road for a long time. And then coming home, the flight might be 15 hours of flying, 10 hours of driving, and this and that. And it would be a very, very long day. And when I would start coming down that road to Ananda Village, I would see that barn. And I knew when I saw that barn, I knew that Ananda is just behind that barn. And I knew that I was 99.999% of the way home at that moment. And I just want to tell you, trust that when Yoganandaji said God is just behind your thoughts, because sometimes we sit to meditate, what happens, it's frustrating because we have all these thoughts. They just don't seem to go away. But trust that you're really, really, really close. You've probably been driving, flying, traveling for who knows how many millions of incarnations. That's how long it takes to get to this point where you sit down to meditate and start saying, Lord, I want to know you. Then the thoughts come, and you're that close. God is just behind those thoughts. And all it takes is a few puffs of aspiration, devotion, divine grace, patience. So maybe it takes 10, 20, 30 years of meditation before you start having that realization. don't you realize 10, 20, 30 years of meditation is like 10 to 20, 30 seconds in the time that was taking us to get to millions and millions of incarnations to get to this point. So be patient. And it doesn't take much patience to sit for 30 years. We think 30 years is a long time. But considering how many millions of incarnations we've traveled to get to this point, we're so close. And you just have no idea how close everyone in this room is to finding realization. And so many people give up right at the very end. It's kind of like if I'd been spending 24 hours on the road and I saw that barn and I thought, oh, it's so far away. I've been traveling so far, and I give up and drop dead right half a mile from Ananda village after driving and flying halfway around the world. That's what it's like to give up when you have a teacher, a teaching, a divine guru, the practice of meditation. And that's what it's like to give up just because it seems hard for a few years even, or even 10 or 20 years. So be patient, be kind with yourself. God is kind and infinitely compassionate with us. There will be tests along the way. It's just inevitable that we face a lot of tests, a lot of challenges, a lot of karmas. This is the nature of the dream and of duality. But even in those, every single one of them really is a gift from the Guru, from Divine Mother, to help us take the next step spiritually. I had an unusual experience and very inspiring one. A few years ago, I was driving in Pune, and I was driving by myself. And when I drive by myself, I tend to get very thoughtful for some reason, even if I'm scrambling for my life on Indian roads and dodging cars trying to kill me and run over me and drive me off the road. And I don't play music, I just get very inward. And so I came to a stoplight, and there's the usual scene there. There was beggars and people, beggars but selling things, and just really very destitute people. And normally I'm somewhat immune to it. My heart goes out to them, but I'm not deeply touched by it. I pray and send energy, but it just, for some reason, it's never, maybe I've done it in recent lifetimes like that, and so I know that people will get out of it. But there was one man, for some reason at that moment, that really deeply touched me, way more than normally would be. He was a very older man, and I think he was probably both physically and mentally handicapped, the way he was moving around and offering pencils for sale and such. And my heart went out, and I just started praying deeply to Divine Mother. And I just said to her, what are you doing? I mean, this is your child, and you're not taking care of your child. Why are you doing this? And why did you have so many children? Just zillions of them. This is one of my big complaints with. A couple times I've tried to tell her that we have ways of kind of controlling such things where we live down here. But I actually asked a mother one time, why did she have so many children? And this mother, who's very wise, said, just purely out of this love that wants to expand and share and grow and share it with so many and with so much. And that's why it's expanded and turned into this never-ending sort of expansion of souls and trouble and heartache. So I was sincerely and deeply praying, why are you allowing this to happen? And because I was inward and quiet, and I really was looking for an answer, I wasn't just complaining, as I do sometimes. I was really listening for an answer. And I really felt that she was answering me, and because I heard a very particular sentence in my mind. Almost, it was like words being spoken. I wouldn't say that she came to me in a vision and spoke words. I think she maybe, though, spoke through my intuition, because these words were very true, and they were also very compassionate. Those words were referring to this man particularly, because I was asking, but really referring to all of us. The words were, I give each one exactly what they need. And there was a great deal of compassion behind it, and just even also a great deal of meaning and truth. I give each one exactly, meaning each one is my very own. It's not accidental, it's not random what happens to us. It's not cruel or kind and just kind of some strange thing. I give each one of my children exactly then what they need. not what they deserve or what they earned because of karma, or it's not punishment. It's what they need to grow and take the next step. And in that moment, I could really see the compassion of God being given to this man who was really in a state of seeming suffering and difficulty. And I could see on some level, I really believe that his soul also understood that this is what he needed. And Swamiji talked about this one time. He said that he was somewhere, I don't remember where it was, in Kolkata, I think it was. And there was a bunch of beggars, around a temple, and just a whole larger crowd of them, as we sometimes see. But he said this one girl that was there, he said that she looked like she was a princess or a queen. She had this very royal energy, very refined, but she also had a lot of suffering and pain in her face. And he really tried to tune in to what her soul was and why she was there. And he said that he really felt that she was a princess, a Rani, in a past lifetime. But she had gotten greedy and held on to her wealth and did not share with anybody. And she needed to have a lifetime of being destitute and understanding how painful it was on some level, on the dream level, but on a very real level also to her soul, to not have and to want and to have lack and to see people not sharing. And he said that he believed that probably very quickly, next lifetime or soon after, she would be a queen or a princess again. God is not cruel, but God gives us exactly what we need. And so she'll come back and be a princess and be a generous one who shares her wealth and her wisdom, everything that she has. And so I have seen that whenever tests and challenges come, yes, it's a dream. We can't just throw it off and say it's a dream. But if you are really tuning into God and looking at the one, tuning into the one behind that, all the false shadows on the screen of duality, you start to understand intuitively why a certain lesson is coming to us. And sometimes we don't need to understand why. We just need to accept it, accept what comes. Sometimes it's patience, sometimes it's endurance. Who knows what it is sometimes. I think sometimes that God gives us information, as they say in the spy world, on a need-to-know basis. And if we don't need to know why a test is being given to us, then God won't tell us, and that's the way it is. And we just need to learn patience, and I think sometimes trust, especially. This is something I've learned in recent years, is just really to learn to trust that whatever comes to me is coming from Divine Mother, from the Guru, from God, giving me exactly what I need, but with love and compassion. And I found the more that I trust, the more that this dream becomes more enjoyable. And it's so interesting that Swamiji talks about austerity, because we think of austerity as something that we do. I'm doing austerity and I'm practicing austerity. And you see the downside of this. You see so many stories in the old Puranas and scriptures about great yogis who did a lot of austerity because they wanted something, and they got really proud spiritually because they were just such great Mahayogis. And you see people who do this. It's like there's some contest to see how big and how many Rudraksha beads you can pile all over yourself and be spiritual and practice austerity. And you see the result of this, as Swamiji says, as sort of a smug self-righteousness. And this is sort of a negative renunciation. We talk about this a lot at our monastery in Khandala, that what Swamiji gave us was positive renunciation. He said it was God-affirming and bliss-affirming renunciation. And what he meant was that it's not about what you don't do and what you let go of, because that can do two things. He said the negative renunciation only, of not doing this, not doing that, you start to define yourself as a renunciate by the things that you do. And you start doing these things, and you start patting yourself on the back and thinking, yeah, I'm becoming a pretty good renunciate. Look at all the things I'm not doing. But that also produces judgment, pride, judgment of others. And so the positive bliss-affirming renunciation that he talked about is what we talk about here, tuning into God, going behind the screen, tuning into God as bliss. And when you tune into God as divine bliss, you will find that then you start to see beyond the duality, the ups and downs. They just don't touch us, not because we're gritting our teeth and saying, this dentist drilling into my tooth, I'm not feeling pain. I'm going to bear this, and no matter how painful it is, it's more that you just feel joy rather than pain because you're tuning in to divine joy more and more. And this is a practice. It's not something that comes all at once, but you'll find that if you practice it regularly in meditation, in life, in moments in between the things of the day, if you just get still and tune into divine joy, you'll find that more and more over time, it becomes easier to experience the bliss and the joy behind all the ups and downs of duality. And so this is the bliss-affirming renunciation that Swamiji talked about. That is for everybody. It's not just for people hiding away in caves. It's for all of us, for everyone in this room. Get a drink of water. Now, when we do this more and more, you'll find that you start to see behind the screen all the time, if you can. But what you find is that it's not just that you become indifferent to what's going on, but that you start to be able to draw the divine through all situations and all circumstances. One of the great challenges for me moving to India was not, what for most Westerners it is. It's that for my entire life, I grew up in the forest, basically. As a child, I grew up in a forest. My backyard was 2 miles by 2 miles of jungle forest that my twin brother and I just played all the time in. When I saw the recent Jungle Book movie and saw Kim running along across logs and swinging on vines, that's exactly what we did, almost. I mean, it was pretty close to that. We didn't have animals talking to us or anything like that. And then I moved to Ananda Village, which is a forest. Trees and everything around, and animals, a lot more animals, deer everywhere and such. And so I've always related to God as being in nature, in the trees, in the forest, in the animals, in the flowers. And so when I moved to India, here I was in a city, and it was a concrete jungle. There was no trees there hardly, and it was hot, and I found that, okay, I need to try to see God, because it's sort of been a practice in my life. When I would walk through the forest at Ananda Village, I would look for God. And it didn't mean I was looking for a vision of Divine Mother. I was just looking for, with expectation and expectancy, for something unusual and beautiful and unique. And very often, I would see such things, like an owl in a really distant tree or something like that I would not have seen if I wasn't looking for the divine in things. And so you'll find that if you're always looking for the divine, it doesn't happen every time you go out, but more and more you do start to see it. And so being in Indian cities, I finally woke up. This is it took me a long time to figure this out, so forgive me for being so slow-minded. But of course I realized that the most divine, natural, and nature aspect of God is the human being. The divine is in each person everywhere. And Master, one time, he was having a vision of Divine Mother, and he was in ecstasy. And he looked at the disciples and he said, "Oh, you have no idea how beautiful you all are." And he was pointing to all of them. It wasn't just the saints among his disciples. It was all of them equally, because he was seeing the divine in each one. And I found that what I do now is when I'm in a city and there's hordes of people and it's the concrete jungle, I people watch and I just look at the people, but for me it's God watching. I look for the divine quality in each one. And I find if I look hard enough, often enough, you start to see it. And not all the time. It's like God playing hide and seek. And sometimes maybe for a long time you don't see. But you'll find if you make this a practice of trying to look behind the veil, not just be indifferent and say it's a dream, it's duality, because that's just the first step. The next step is to see the one and commune with the one behind the screen. Swami Kriyanandaji did this so very, very well, really amazingly well, because he saw God in all people, he saw God in everyone. He drew the divine out of people. He found the divine in all situations. Here was someone who went through amazing suffering in his life in terms of the physical body and surgeries, and doctors would look at his medical record and look at him and look at the record, and it just didn't make sense, because here was someone who had gone through just about the most intense physical life they had ever seen, and this person sitting there was so joyful and in bliss most of the time. So for these doctors, it made no sense at all. So it wasn't that he was indifferent. It was that he saw God behind it all, even his own suffering. And that's the catch, is that sometimes it's easy to see it in others when they're suffering and to see that they'll get through it, that God is with them. But then when we suffer and go through challenges, it's a little bit more difficult to see it. But this comes with meditation, with time, with always bringing our gaze back to the beam coming from the back of the room, which goes back to God. And when we can do that more and more, then we receive so much more of grace and bliss. And Swamiji had this attribute. He tells of his time with Anandamoyi Ma. And it was so interesting what he said about this, because she had many disciples. It wasn't like he was even a disciple of hers, but he actually perhaps was the closest of all. And what she said about him confirms that. And I'm just going to read this. He was visiting her a couple times. This is some of his very first visits. And she said to him, "Many thousands have come to this body. None have attracted me as you have." And Swamiji writes, "The translators emphasized several times to me that she had said none out of many thousands." Another time she said, "There are people who have been with me for 25 years and more, but they haven't taken from me what you have." And then to others, I'm told, she once said, "Here is a lotus in a pond. Many frogs sit under the lotus croaking. Then a bee flies in, takes the honey, and flies away. Kriyananda is that bee." And so this is an analogy that Master often used, is to be the bee that goes in and takes the honey. And as a gardener of many, many decades, and just spending thousands of hours in gardens, I've actually worked a lot around bees. I've kept bees one time and with a beehive, and become very friendly with bees. They're just among the most benign creatures. And I've had to harvest basil flowers, just a whole patch of it, and there'll be hundreds of bees. And they're so benign that you can cut all these flowers, and there's still hundreds of bees as you're holding the flowers, just flying all around you. And I've never been stung. One time in like 40 years of gardening, I was stung. And that's because I accidentally stepped on a bee on the lawn at the Crystal Hermitage, and it was just a reaction. I couldn't avoid it. So they're very friendly. Butterflies are also friendly, but they flit around. They just hop from one flower to another. They're distracted very easily. They try this, they try that, but the bee goes deep. It goes, and sometimes you'll see a bee going into a flower, these sort of tubular flowers, and the bee goes in there, and it's just buzzing and humming, and you can tell it's just enjoying drawing in all this nectar, and it's just wrapped in this deep immersion of the flower. And this is what Swami Kriyanandaji was. He went deep. He went deep into this connection with Anandamoyi Ma, but he would see God everywhere in that way. After she left the body, and this is something I only heard once, so I can't really confirm it, but it sounded true. He did an astral ascension ceremony for her. And then afterwards, he was talking to a few people. And he remarked that he once had a private interview with Anandamoyi Ma, and it's mentioned in his writings, but that her disciples were all scandalized because he had this private interview with her in her room. And someone asked, "Well, why? I mean, you just went in there, had an interview, and it came out." And then he said very quietly, he said, "It's because I was in there with her for 6 hours," which is just stunning to hear that. And I imagine they were meditating for 6 hours. They were going deep into God, into bliss for 6 hours. He was that bee going very, very deep. So when we do this in life, and again, it's a practice. It takes time. It takes many, many incarnations. But this life, we have a great blessing. We have great masters. We have great teachers. We have the awareness and intelligence that, yes, I've suffered enough, millions of lifetimes. I want out. And they've given us the way out. They've shown us how to do it. They've given us practices to do it. And all it takes is simply doing it. You just don't realize how close you all are. all of us are. And I'm just talking about all of us, every single person in this room. I've seen this over the years with pretty much everyone who I've known with Ananda, who has practiced these things to the end of life. And one of them, which some of you are a little bit familiar with, my wife, Maria, who passed away about 10 years ago. And she was one of these souls. She wasn't unique in that sense. She was unique because she was her own self, and she was a unique character and very joyful. And Dharmarajan was just telling me some very funny stories about her, about their connection, even up to the very end of her life, just how joyful and humorous and mischievous and different things that she was. But I've seen without exception that Ananda people are themselves to the very end. They don't become some rubber-stamped, imitation of everybody else. But they also have great divine freedom from living a life for God. And sometimes it doesn't come to the very end, but I've seen that it comes without exception, this divine freedom. One thing I found helpful is, after seeing this so many times, when I'm going through life and there's difficulties and challenges, I know for myself it's the same, that without exception, if I just keep serving Guru, loving others, sharing Divine Mother's joy and love with others, practicing meditation, the presence of God, I know without exception that I also will be almost, if not completely free at the end of this life, because I've seen it so many times. And so when I go through these things, it's a movie, and when the movie has intense parts, I think sometimes we all have favorite movies that we see again and again. And sometimes when we see the movie again, there's a really intense part that can be very emotional and traumatic, but we always remember. But I know that this movie ends really, really, really well. And so that sort of kind of gets us through those tough parts. And one of the things with watching so many become so free towards the end, again, without exception, I just know completely confidently that no matter what I'm going through, the movie ends really, really well. And just by not affirming it, by knowing it to the core of my being, even in that moment, I feel that freedom. And I'm less and less touched by those tests and challenges that come. So we're going to play something Dharmarajan sent me via email last night, something I haven't heard in a few years. And it's a very interesting recording. It's just about 2.5 minutes long. And it's of Swami Kriyanandaji talking about my wife, Maria, right at the very end of her life, when she was very close to leaving the body, because she left with just amazing freedom and joy. There was so much humor at the end of her life, and she spoke very little. She was in God. She wasn't treating it lightly. She didn't take visitors. About the only words she ever said to me the last week or two was Om Guru, Om Guru. I needed to help her at times, and she made some hilarious jokes only. That was all she ever just about did. The last time she had to walk across, and I'll just share this one, she had to walk across the room, and she had brain tumors that were just basically filling her brain, and she lost her balance, inability to stand balanced. But she was so joyful and so positive in the midst of all this sort of disorientation. And the last time she was able to stand, we were lying in bed, and she went to go to the bathroom. And when she came back, she was like staggering all back and forth and unable to really stand. I thought she was going to hurt herself, so I went rushing up and sort of carried her back to the bed. And so we lied down, and as we were lying there, she just was laughing and laughing, just like a child, with complete delight. And she grew up in the Soviet Union, so just so you know, this is the joke that she was referring to. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" I just couldn't understand what she found funny about that. And she just said, "Russian ballet." And she was talking about the way that she staggered back to the room. And there was a few more moments of just, she was seeing the dream, and not just seeing the dream, but enjoying the dream. No, even though it was maybe the most unfathomably scary thing for most people, that she was about to leave the body and it was disorienting, but for her it was just, she was in God. And this is the promise. It's not just a promise, but it's the reality for all of us who stay with it and keep going on this life. And so we'll end with Swamiji talking about Maria. But remember, he's really talking about all of us in a way, and the hope and the promise that all of us have. So.
And why don't you just start enjoying yourself enjoy whatever comes to you. And if tragedy seems to come, it's not really tragedy. Look at the other side and you'll find out that it worked out just the way it had to. Death works out just the way it has to. You know, there's one woman at Ananda village now who's on the point of death, and her brain is just completely frazzled. There's all sorts of things going on, tumors and so on. There's just no hope for her. And she's taking it very calmly, very peacefully, and she says it's just right. And I have seen over the years, she had cancer of the breast years ago, and she got chemotherapy and had to go through a great deal of pain from that. But now she's reached a point of maturity where nothing can touch her. It is so thrilling to see people reach that point of understanding where death itself is welcome. It doesn't matter. You know that you have accomplished what you needed to accomplish. You know that you are who you want to be. Who? All right, who? And with all of this, you'll see that underlying all of life, there is bliss. Life itself is, well, at the end of it all, when you've gone through all this long trail, seeking who you really are, then you will understand that it was well worth it. Every saint who ever found God has said it was well worth it.